Who were the people of the Old Testament, and where in the world did they live? The various people groups seen in the Old Testament stories lived in a region of the world known as the ancient Near East. People in this region mainly dwelt in places where water was located. These areas form roughly the shape of a crescent, and many people call these inhabited areas the Fertile Crescent because of their abundance of food and water. The Fertile Crescent is also where agriculture first had its beginnings. The Fertile Crescent is made up of three distinct areas: the Nile Delta, Syria-Palestine, and Mesopotamia. The Mesopotamian Valley is the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers and has been home to many different cultural groups in ancient times, such as the Sumerians. The Sumerians showed up in the southern part of the Mesopotamian Valley in the early part of the 3rd millennium BC. Sumerians invented wedge-shaped writing called cuneiform and built cities such as Eridu, Ur, Larsa, and Nippur. We also have them to thank for the Enuma Elish, a creation story that shares a number of similarities to the biblical creation story of Genesis written later. The Amorites. The Amorites dominated virtually all parts of Mesopotamia and Syria-Palestine by the 18th century BC. They were a Semitic group who established the cities of Mari and Babylon as centers of their political power. Archaeologists have discovered thousands of inscriptions from Mari that deal with legal, domestic, and business matters, and have many similarities to the law code of Deuteronomy that came later, which makes sense because the ancient ancestors of Israel were themselves Amorites. The Assyrians. The Assyrians lived in the northern part of Mesopotamia with Ashur and Nineveh as their chief cities. The Assyrians launched an empire-building program in the 8th century BC under the leadership of Tiglath-Pileser III and gained political power over Syria, Israel, and even Egypt. In the middle of the 7th century BC, Assyria began to decline in power and lost control of its empire to the Medes, Babylonians, and Scythians. The Babylonians destroyed Nineveh in 612 BC. The Babylonians. The Babylonians became a major political power in the southern part of Mesopotamia, which came to be known as Babylonia, in the 7th century BC. The city of Babylon on the Euphrates River was their most influential city. In 587 BC, the Babylonians captured Jerusalem and forced the Jews to go into exile in Babylon. The Jewish exile lasted until 539 BC, when Babylon was taken over by the Persian Empire. Cyrus, the Persian king, gave freedom to the Jews in exile, and he allowed them to return to their homeland. However, many Jewish communities continued to exist in Babylon even after the exile came to an end. The Persians. The Persians became a major political power in the 6th century BC under the leadership of Cyrus. Their home was in what is now modern-day Iran. The Persian Empire extended westward to include Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, and extended eastward as far as India. Eventually, the Persians declined in strength, and their empire later became part of the world that Alexander the Great conquered around 330 BC. The second region of the Fertile Crescent is the Nile Delta region. The Old Testament states that Egypt was home to the people of Israel in their early years. Israel remembered Egypt as the land of bondage. Egypt continued to exert political power over Israel at various times, and Israel's kings often made alliances with Egypt, even though the prophets condemned such actions as a return to slavery. A large group of Jews fled to Egypt during the Babylonian invasion of Judah in 587 BC. Later, Alexandria became a center of Jewish life in Egypt. The Egypt of the Old Testament is the northern part of the modern land of Egypt, also known as Lower Egypt or the Delta region, with the ancient Israelites reportedly living as slaves in the region of Goshen before fleeing to Sinai. Egyptian history can be divided into 5 periods. The Old Kingdom period, which lasted from 2900 to 2300 BC, is known as the Age of the Pyramids. During this time, Egypt led the world in architectural and scientific advancement. The first intermediate period lasted from 2300 to 2100 BC, and there were many power struggles between the pharaohs of Lower and Upper Egypt during this time. Eventually, the powers of Upper Egypt gained total control. The Middle Kingdom period lasted from 2100 to 1710 BC, and Abraham shows up towards the end of this period. The second intermediate period lasted from 1710 to 1550 BC, during which the Semitic Hyksos ruled for over 100 years. Joseph and the rest of the family of Jacob, or Israel, showed up around this time, and the Egyptians eventually took back control from the Hyksos. The New Kingdom period lasted from 1550 to 330 BC. Some of the most famous of pharaohs, including Tutankhamun or King Tut, ruled during this time period. Egypt prospered greatly for a couple hundred years during this time, but gradually began to fall into decline due to many reasons, including poor leadership, drought, and other natural disasters. Also, Moses shows up towards the beginning of this period to initiate the exodus from Egypt. The third and final region of the Fertile Crescent is known as Syria-Palestine. Syria-Palestine is the most frequently mentioned region in the Old Testament. This region is made up of countries such as Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine on the political map today. The Canaanites. Before Israel entered into the land of Palestine, or Canaan, the land was inhabited by many different groups of people known as the Canaanites. Cities like Jericho, Megiddo, Beth-Shan, Ai, Shechem, Gezer, and Lachish were centers of the Canaanite culture in the 3rd millennium BC. The Philistines. The Philistines were the primary inhabitants on the coastal plain southwest of Canaan on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. They likely came to this region from the island of Crete in the Mediterranean around 1200 BC. Biblical records say that the Philistines were a constant threat to the Israelites. The Phoenicians. The Phoenicians inhabited the northwest area on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. They were traders and seagoing people who spread into Palestine and influenced the culture and religion of the Canaanites. The Arameans, aka Syrians. The Arameans made Aram or Syria their home during the 2nd millennium BC. The ancestors of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, maintained contact with this region. The earliest confessional creed of Israel, found in Deuteronomy 26:5-10, refers to the father of Israel, most likely Jacob, as a wandering Aramean. The people of Israel had frequent border struggles with the Arameans from the 10th through the 8th centuries BC. The center of the state of the Arameans was Damascus, which remains as the capital of Syria today. The Ammonites and the Moabites. The book of Genesis casts a negative light on the ancestry of these people, claiming that they came to exist through an incestuous relationship between Abraham's nephew Lot and his 2 daughters. The Ammonites lived directly east of the Jordan Valley, with Rabbath Ammon, the location of modern Ammon, as their capital. The Moabites were located south of the Ammonite territory. The Ammonites and Moabites maintained social and religious contact, including marriage relationships with the Israelite population. Probably the most famous Moabite in the Old Testament is Ruth, the great-grandmother of David, Israel's greatest king. The Edomites. The book of Genesis describes the Edomites as the descendants of Esau, Jacob's twin brother. The Edomites were considered some of Israel's closest relatives, and they were located directly south of Moab. The Edomites were much more hostile towards Israel than were the Ammonites and Moabites. The close relationship of the Israelites and the Edomites and their deep hostility towards each other can be seen in the stories of the twin brothers Jacob and Esau and their constant struggle with one another. Jacob and Esau were also known as Israel and Edom. The Midianites. The Midianites occupied the land southeast of Edom. The book of Genesis traces the origin of the Midianites to Abraham and Keturah, whom Genesis claims is Abraham's wife after the death of Sarah. According to the book of Exodus, Moses married a woman named Zipporah, who was the daughter of a Midianite priest. During the time of the Judges, the Midianites were one of many groups that oppressed the Israelites. The Amalekites. The Amalekites were located directly south of Canaan, in the Negev area. The book of Genesis claims that the Amalekites were also descendants of Esau. The book of Exodus claims that the Amalekites were the very first nation to wage war against the Israelites during Israel's journey to the Promised Land. So there you have it, some of the major people groups and cultures of the Old Testament, and where in the world they lived.